Hello, I'm Nakhchivan. Welcome aboard the Eastern Express, and as always, I hope you enjoy the journey. Almost 40 years of conflict, and now a deal. One brokered not in Moscow, not in Brussels, but in Washington. Russia was left sidelined, while Iran is nervous. The United States right in the middle. But in the Caucasus, nothing is final until it's tested. The US just inserted itself into the heart of the South Caucasus with a deal that could reshape the region's geopolitics. That puts Vladimir Putin in a difficult position, watching another conflict in the post-Soviet space be resolved without Moscow's help. Before we go further, here is a look at our latest report to find out more what's going on with the deal between Armenia and Azerbaijan.
This meeting between the leaders of Azerbaijan, Armenia and the United States can be called historic. After months of tense negotiations, it seems that the two rival South Caucasus nations have reached an accord, and this goes beyond just normalizing relations. For Azerbaijan, it also means the lifting of military restrictions imposed by the US.
Really, it's a day which will be remembered by the people of Azerbaijan with a feeling of pride and gratitude to President Trump.
For Armenia, it means a chance to safely pursue new partnerships and focus on its internal struggles in the wake of the conquest of Nagorno-Karabakh. For both, it is an opportunity to at least try to build new relations with each other.
We're laying a foundation to write a better story than the one we had in the past.
For the United States, this accord is a show of diplomatic and political strength. Both Azerbaijan and Armenia have close ties with Russia, and the symbolism of Moscow's absence at this table is very telling.
The country of Armenia and Azerbaijan are committing to stop all fighting forever, open up commerce, travel, and diplomatic relations, and respect each other's sovereignty and territorial integrity.
One of the key provisions of the agreement is the creation of a transit corridor linking Azerbaijan proper with the exclave of Nakhchivan under US oversight. This corridor has been a long-standing dispute between both countries. The icing on the cake for the US president is the floating of the idea that Armenia and Azerbaijan jointly nominate Trump for the Nobel Peace Prize. The accord, while important, is not a formal peace treaty. It allows both countries to normalize relations and work towards a permanent end to hostilities, but that may still be a far-off goal.
And now let's zone in on the East-splaining portion of our show. The conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan dates as far back as the times of the Soviet Union, to the late 1980s. Since then, both sides have scored victories against the other, and any attempts at a lasting peace have seemingly been doomed to fail.
The rivalry between Baku and Yerevan has, for the most part, been centered on the Nagorno-Karabakh region. Although Azerbaijan finally conquered the territory in late 2023, that did not mean an end to hostilities or the normalization of relations. Far from it, Azerbaijan's president went on to demand further concessions from Armenia and use outright harsh rhetoric against the country amid peace talks. Armenia itself was left without powerful allies after Russian peacekeepers failed to intervene in 2023, making Yerevan's position very precarious. Armenia's population has also had a very mixed reaction to a potential peace deal between the two countries, as it views Azerbaijan as untrustworthy, and vice versa, pointing to the mass displacement of thousands of ethnic Armenians in the wake of Nagorno-Karabakh's takeover. Despite some public pushback, however, an accord has been struck, and it will have consequences for the region. It can mean an end to Armenia's partial economic isolation, as some degree of trade with Azerbaijan may be restored. For Azerbaijan, it is a huge amount of political capital and a boost to its image both domestically and abroad. Peace talks will likely continue, though not many are convinced that they will amount to a full peace treaty in the near future.
And now we're zooming in on Yerevan and Baku and Washington to take a look at the issue in greater detail. On the 8th of August, President Donald Trump announced what he calls the Trump Route for International Peace and Prosperity, TRIPP for short. Yes, there is a catchy name, because of course there is a catchy name. The idea is simple on paper. Armenia will lease the United States a transit corridor across its territory, connecting mainland Azerbaijan to its Nakhchivan exclave. US management of the corridor gives Azerbaijan the access it's wanted for decades, while letting Armenia claim it is still in control of its own land. That clever arrangement removes the biggest sticking point in almost 4 decades of on and off conflict between Yerevan and Baku. And just to sweeten the deal, the US is promising economic incentives for both sides. Washington says it will invest in the corridor's infrastructure and deepen trade ties with both Armenia and Azerbaijan. For Prime Minister Pashinyan, it's a way to finally sign a peace agreement and pivot Armenia towards the west and away from Moscow's orbit. For President Aliyev, it is a victory he can sell at home as securing Azerbaijani access to Nakhchivan without Armenian interference. For the United States, it is a strategic foothold in a region that connects Europe, the Middle East and Central Asia. It is a boost to the Middle Corridor trade route, a direct challenge to Russia's influence, and a headache for Iran. Because make no mistake, this deal moves more than goods. It moves power with them too. Russia, the traditional heavyweight in the Caucasus, is now watching from the sidelines. The Kremlin wanted a peacekeeping role in any corridor agreement. In the end, it got nothing. Konstantin Zatulin, a senior Russian MP, called the TRIPP the squeezing of Russia out of the Caucasus. And he's not wrong. Armenia is now leasing part of its territory to Washington for up to 99 years. That's not a very temporary agreement. And then there is Iran. The corridor runs very close to its northern border. Tehran fears it could host a US strategic listening post. Close enough to hear every whisper coming out of Iran's military installations. Economically, they are just as alarmed. Armenia has become a key outlet for Iranian trade, including sanctions-busting shipments between Tehran and Moscow. A US-controlled corridor threatens to choke that route. Now, we need to remember one thing. Despite the smiles in the White House, this isn't a done deal. The exact terms of US management still have to be hammered out. Deals are fragile, Interests shift. But since this one doesn't rely on Russia as the guarantor, in fact, it sidelines Moscow entirely, it might have a chance to hold. But for now, the TRIPP has only just begun. And now here to shed more light on the issue is Dr. Konrad Zasztoft, lecturer at the University of Warsaw, Academic Center for Strategic Communication. Hello and welcome to Eastern Express.
Hello, thank you for having me.
So the deal between Armenia and Azerbaijan, would you say that it is truly revolutionary and that it is likely to bring a long-lasting peace to the region, as was promised during the conference at the White House?
Well, everyone hopes so. There's a lot of chances that peace will be there in Caucasus between the two countries, Armenia, Azerbaijan. After the war, which lasted since early 1990s or even earlier, because the conflict it started even at the end of the before the collapse of the Soviet Union. The actual peace treaty was negotiated between two sides and was ready already in the beginning of this year. But since February, we heard about this. There is this document, but we didn't know anything about the content of the document. And now, after this meeting in Washington, which was, I think, historical, very important, and especially involvement of the United States is important guarantee of that this document, this peace will function in the region. But still, it's necessary to also underline that this is not the final peace treaty. What the two leaders signed together with Donald Trump in Washington is like a preliminary peace treaty. So all the details, there are many details which still should be negotiated, and probably we will see another final peace treaty in recent in next months, I guess.
So that's a very important point that you've made, that this document doesn't have the status of a formal peace deal. But you've also mentioned another thing, namely the US involvement. Now, this was something that actually caught quite a few commentators by surprise, because people were expecting, obviously, a meeting at the White House, perhaps a promise of a closer cooperation towards achieving a lasting ability to coexist. But few people actually expected the US to become involved in a way that they did, or at least that they promised to be involved. So can you actually break down what was agreed and how will this change the balance of power in the region right now?
Well, the U.S. involvement is related to the strategically very important small region, which is called sometimes Zangezur Corridor, or in Armenian it's called Syunik, the province of Syunik, which is the southernmost province of Armenia, linking Armenia with Iran. So it's strategically important for Armenia, but this is also important for Azerbaijan, because Azerbaijan has its territories on both sides of this Zangezur corridor, because there is the whole territory of Azerbaijan to the east and Autonomous Republic of Nakhchivan to the west of this Zangezur corridor. So obviously Azerbaijan wants to have this communication road to Nakhchivan. And in recent years, there were many discussions how it will look like, this corridor. So there were some, let's say, fears in Yerevan that Azerbaijan simply wants to take over this small 42-kilometer corridor and take some part of Armenian territory. So that's why the
Extraterritorial
US
corridors, I mean, extraterritorial corridors from a historical perspective, they often actually foreshadow bad things happening, but this is likely to be different. Now, originally, Russia wanted to get involved in this project, and as we've seen, it never actually got off the ground. Now, how did the involvement of the US instead of Russia actually provide this sort of crucial shift, which all of a sudden allowed Azerbaijan and Armenia to sit down and say, well, we agree on the principles, we're going to iron out the details, but overall, we're pretty happy with what we've got?
Yes, so as you said, according to 2020 ceasefire agreement from November 2020, there should be Russian forces, FSB, controlling this corridor, but that never happened. We may only guess why, but I think for Russia, this solving this issue between Armenia and Azerbaijan was not important, or even we may guess that it was for Russia important to still have this conflict between the two countries, so Russia could somehow manage this conflict and for its own interest. When we look on the side of the United States, for the United States, since the beginning of it was important that Caucasus should be this kind of important trade route, so the communication should be open, and of course, precondition was peace between Armenia and Azerbaijan. So we can say simply that this geopolitical vision of the United States is now becoming reality. And of course, it's against the interests of Moscow.
Not only Moscow, Iran has also made some rather unfriendly comments initially. They are trying to downplay this change right now. But from a geopolitical perspective, this really does change the calculus for both Russia and Iran. Can you explain what is likely to happen now as a result of this? How will this affect the balance of power?
Well, Iran is using strong words. Iran is conflicted with Azerbaijan. So in last years there were many, for example, military exercises, maneuvers on the border, close to the border with Azerbaijan. So Iran was trying to show its strength, but we should also remember that Azerbaijani army is modernized. It's biggest army in the South Caucasus. And to add to this, Azerbaijan has important ally, which is Turkey. Basically, we can say that Azerbaijan and Turkey, the two countries, are now dominant military powers in the region. So, and Iran, of course, after recent developments, after the Israeli attacks and American attacks on Iran, Iran is much weaker than it used to be. So I think these strong words on the side of the Iran, these are just words.
So Iran is actually worried about two things. First thing is that its trade with Armenia could suffer. But also there is another issue, namely that there is going to be an American-operated entity basically controlling or managing this new Zangezur corridor development. Now, this puts American presence close to Iran itself. And while we're not initially talking any sort of military presence, it is not difficult to see why Iran might actually be looking at this and saying, well, we didn't see it coming and it's not a good development for us.
Yes, indeed. And on the one hand, yes, this is worrying Iran because there will be some Americans there in the region. Of course, from what we know, we are not talking about the American army troops, but rather some private entity. But still, this will be American presence there in the region. But on the other hand, there is also a much longer border between Azerbaijan and Iran. And Azerbaijan is already, since many years, for example, in some kind of alliance with Israel. So from the point of view of Iran, the problem is that they had one hostile state from their point of view, which was Azerbaijan, and now the Armenia, which used to be friendly in friendly relations with Iran, now it will be more closer to the West, to the United States. So this is like another problem from the point of view of Tehran.
So now let's return quickly to the way this is being perceived in Azerbaijan and Armenia. From the point of view of societies, which of these two countries is likely to be more happy and which is likely to have more reservations about the future?
Well, I think it's from what I heard from some commentaries after this Friday and before this Friday meeting, I think there is a positive attitude in both countries because there are some gains for both sides, obviously. So, as I mentioned before, Armenia was afraid of this kind of military aggression scenario. So, the scenario in which Azerbaijan is trying to take over militarily this Zangezur corridor. Now, with this American involvement, I don't think it's likely. So, for Armenia, it's obviously a very big gain. Now, for Azerbaijan, it's also very very good news. This deal, Washington deal, because simply the problem of communication between Nakhchivan Autonomous Republic and the rest of Azerbaijan will be solved soon. But there are many other issues which were discussed in Washington. So, for example, Azerbaijan was not able to buy weapons from the United States since the early 1990s, because by that time Congress decided that because of this conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan, Nagorno-Karabakh conflict, Azerbaijan will not be allowed to buy American weapons. Now, with President Trump, Azerbaijan again made by American weapons. So this is another good news for the Azerbaijani side.
Konrad Zasztoft was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight.
Thank you.
And now we move on to Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you absolutely don't want to miss. US President Donald Trump is pushing for a peace deal between Russia and Ukraine, which will probably include Ukraine ceding territory to Russia. The US is reportedly likely to agree, but Kiev is poised to reject such an agreement.
At next week's meeting in Alaska, the first between Putin and a US president since the start of the Russian invasion, the two leaders will discuss a peace plan for the war in Ukraine. Russia reportedly will demand the ceding of new territory from Ukraine, according to a plan that Vladimir Putin passed to US Special Envoy Steve Witkoff during his recent visit to Moscow. This would entail Ukraine pulling out of the two partially occupied Ukrainian regions of Donetsk and Luhansk, according to an anonymous source in the Ukrainian presidential office. In exchange, Russia is to reportedly withdraw from the northeastern Kharkiv and Sumy regions. The southern Zaporizhia and Kherson regions are to remain at the current demarcation line. European and Ukrainian officials have reportedly discussed the Russian proposal with their US counterparts and have essentially rejected it. They have supposedly offered a counter-proposal to US officials. European leaders have also re-emphasized that no deal should be reached without Kiev's input and presence.
Russia and Belarus are trying to renew their efforts to orchestrate a migration crisis within the European Union, according to the British Telegraph. This time, they are reportedly using the help of a Libyan warlord, Khalifa Haftar.
European Commission officials claim that they have tracked a rising number of flights between the Libyan and Belarusian capitals. There is speculation that this increased number of arrivals in Minsk may be linked to a new undertaking by Belarus and Russia to create a migration crisis within the EU's borders aimed at destabilizing the bloc. This strategy was already employed by Minsk and Moscow in 2021 ahead of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Back then, thousands of illegal migrants attempted to breach Belarus's borders with Poland, Lithuania and Latvia while being assisted by Belarusian authorities. As a result, many EU countries bordering not just Belarus but also Russia itself have tightened or outright shut down their border crossings and introduced several new defences, such as walls or fences, meant to impede such efforts.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates. I'm Jonasz Rewiński. Bye for now.